The air inside Madison Square Garden on March 8, 1971, crackled with an electricity that transcended sport. This wasn't merely a boxing match. This was theater, politics, religion, and rebellion, all compressed into a single night under the bright lights of New York City. Muhammad Ali, the exiled champion who had been stripped of his title for refusing to fight in Vietnam, was finally returning to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Across the ring stood Joe Frazier, the man who had worn the heavyweight crown in Ali's absence, a relentless warrior with fists like sledgehammers and a pride that wouldn't bend. The world had been waiting for this collision, and everyone who mattered wanted to be there to witness it. The tickets were nearly impossible to obtain. Ringside seats sold for unprecedented prices, transforming the fight into the most expensive sporting event in history up to that point. But money alone couldn't guarantee entry into this exclusive arena. You needed to be someone, or at least know someone who was someone. The crowd that assembled that night read like a directory of American power and fame. Actors rubbed shoulders with senators, musicians exchanged nods with mobsters, and the line between legitimate celebrity and underworld royalty blurred in the cigarette smoke that hung over the crowd like morning fog. Frank Sinatra was there, not as a spectator, but as a photographer for Life magazine, snapping pictures from the ring apron. Dustin Hoffman sat mesmerized in his seat. Bill Cosby, at the peak of his television fame, watched intently. The Kennedys were represented, as were Wall Street titans and Hollywood producers. This was a gathering of America's elite, a rare moment when the entire social hierarchy compressed into one room, all eyes turned toward two men who would spend the next 15 rounds trying to destroy each other. The fight itself carried meanings far beyond the sport. Ali represented defiance, the counterculture, the voice of Black America demanding justice and recognition. He had sacrificed everything for his principles, losing 3.5 years of his prime, facing prison, becoming a lightning rod for controversy. Frazier, though also black, had become cast as the establishment's champion, the hard-working everyman who had played by the rules. The narrative was simplistic and unfair to Frazier, but narratives often are when the world needs symbols more than nuance. In this pressure cooker of celebrity, wealth, and historical significance, every face in the crowd was scrutinized. Security was tight. Photographers captured not just the fighters, but the audience itself, documenting who sat where, who wore what, who belonged in this rarefied space. Among the familiar faces of screen and stage, among the recognizable profiles of political power, there were always a few unknowns, people whose presence raised quiet questions. On this particular night, one man in a spectacular chinchilla coat would answer those questions in ways that would change his life forever. He sat in the front row, impossible to miss, equally impossible to place, and that combination would prove to be his fatal mistake. Nobody knew who he was, and that was precisely the problem. In a room filled with faces the world recognized instantly, one man sat in the most coveted seats in Madison Square Garden, wearing a coat that cost more than most Americans earned in a year, and he was a complete ghost to everyone watching. Frank Lucas occupied space reserved for legends, yet his name meant nothing to the general public. He wasn't an actor whose films they'd seen, wasn't a musician whose records they'd bought, wasn't an athlete whose victories they'd celebrated. He had no television show, no hit song, no championship belt, and yet there he sat, front row center, draped in luxury that screamed wealth and power, comfortable among people whose names appeared in newspapers and on movie marquees. The front row at the fight of the century wasn't just expensive seating, it was a statement of arrival, a declaration of belonging to America's upper echelon. Every person in those chairs had earned their place through achievement that the world could see and measure. Sinatra had conquered music and film. The athletes had won their championships. The politicians had won their elections. The mobsters, well, everyone knew the mobsters, even if they pretended not to. These were recognizable forces in American life, people whose power and influence could be traced and understood. But Frank Lucas? He was an anomaly, a question mark in an expensive coat. He sat perfectly still, watching the fight with the calm demeanor of someone who belonged exactly where he was. There was no nervousness in his posture, no sense that he felt out of place surrounded by fame and power. He didn't gawk at the celebrities around him or seem impressed by his proximity to greatness. Instead, he watched the violence in the ring with the focused attention of a man accustomed to high stakes and life-or-death outcomes. His confidence was complete, his comfort absolute, and that only deepened the mystery. The coat itself demanded attention. Chinchilla, full length, perfectly tailored, catching the lights with every subtle movement. It wasn't just expensive, it was ostentatious, a garment designed to be noticed, to communicate wealth so extreme it bordered on arrogance. In a crowd full of well-dressed people, Lucas stood out. While others wore fine suits and elegant gowns, his coat dominated the visual landscape around him. It was a fashion choice that declared, "I have arrived, I have money, I matter." But who was he? The photographers capturing the crowd didn't recognize him. The reporters working the event couldn't place him. Even the celebrities sitting nearby seemed uncertain about the well-dressed stranger in their midst. Whispers began to circulate during the early rounds. Speculation rippled through the arena, and, more importantly, through the law enforcement officers working security that night. They saw what everyone else saw, an unknown black man displaying wealth that suggested serious money, sitting comfortably among people whose fortunes were legendary, acting like he owned the place. In any other context, an unknown face might blend into the background, forgotten in the excitement of the main event. But this wasn't any other context. This was a gathering under intense scrutiny, where every detail was photographed, every face cataloged, every unusual element noted and questioned. Frank Lucas had made himself impossible to ignore, and in doing so, he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Invisibility had been his greatest asset in building an empire. That night, wearing that coat, sitting in that seat, he threw invisibility away and painted a target on his back that would never completely fade. Frank Lucas had built his empire on a foundation of invisibility. For years, he had operated in the shadows of Harlem, moving heroin through channels he controlled completely, making millions while remaining unknown to law enforcement. His genius wasn't just in the drug trade itself, but in his discipline, his ability to resist the temptations that destroyed other criminals. He had watched flashy dealers get arrested because they couldn't resist showing off their wealth. He had seen men in custom Cadillacs and diamond-encrusted jewelry become targets for both police and rivals. Lucas had always been different, always smarter. He dressed conservatively, drove modest cars, lived quietly. He understood that in the criminal world, attention was death, anonymity was survival. Until it wasn't. Until the night he decided that one moment of glory was worth risking everything he had built. The chinchilla coat cost a fortune, somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 depending on which version of the story you believed. In 1971, that was doctor money, lawyer money, the kind of sum that represented years of honest work for most Americans. The coat was floor-length, impossibly soft, dyed to perfection, tailored to fit his frame like it had been grown on his body. Chinchilla wasn't just expensive fur, it was the most expensive fur, the kind of luxury that separated the merely rich from the genuinely wealthy. Wearing it wasn't a practical choice. New York in March could be cold, but there were 1,000 coats that would have kept him warm without announcing his net worth to everyone within visual range. But practical wasn't the point. The point was arrival. The point was validation. Frank Lucas had come from nothing, from the poverty of rural North Carolina, from a world where black men were expected to bow and scrape and accept whatever scraps the system offered. He had built something enormous through intelligence, ruthlessness, and innovation. He had outsmarted the Italian mobsters who thought they controlled everything. He had created a supply chain that bypassed the traditional drug routes, bringing heroin directly from Southeast Asia in the coffins of American dead soldiers. He was a king, and what good was being a king if nobody knew it? So he wore the coat. He sat in the front row. He surrounded himself with celebrities and power brokers, claiming his seat at the table of American success. For one night, Frank Lucas decided that discretion could go to hell, that he had earned the right to be seen, to be recognized as someone who mattered. The coat was his crown, his declaration of victory, his middle finger to everyone who had ever dismissed him or underestimated him. What he didn't understand, or chose to ignore, was that visibility cuts both ways. The same coat that announced his success to the world also announced it to the New York Police Department, to the Drug Enforcement Administration, to every law enforcement officer working that night who looked at the crowd and asked the obvious question, who is that guy, and where did he get that kind of money? Richie Roberts, the detective who would eventually bring Lucas down, saw the coat. He saw the mystery man in the front row, and his instincts screamed that something was wrong. You didn't sit in those seats unless you were somebody, and if you were somebody, people knew your name. Roberts began asking questions that night, questions that would eventually lead to investigations, surveillance, wiretaps, and ultimately to the destruction of everything Lucas had built. The coat was more than clothing. It was hubris made visible, ego transformed into fabric and fur. It was the moment when Frank Lucas stopped being a criminal mastermind and became just another dealer who couldn't resist showing off. One night, one garment, one catastrophic error in judgment that would echo through the rest of his life. Detective Richie Roberts wasn't at Madison Square Garden for the fight. He was there because power attracts power, and where power congregates, crime often follows. The NYPD knew that major sporting events, especially one of this magnitude, drew more than just legitimate celebrities. Mobsters loved boxing. Drug dealers loved spectacle. Money, legal and illegal, flowed through events like this, and smart cops paid attention to who showed up and where they sat. Roberts was a smart cop, maybe too smart for his own good in a department where many officers had their hands out for payoffs. He was one of the rare straight arrows, a detective who actually turned in nearly $1 million in unmarked cash he'd found during a raid, instead of pocketing it. That kind of honesty made him unusual, sometimes even isolated, but it also made him dangerous to criminals who thought everyone had a price. When Roberts scanned the crowd that night, his eyes stopped on the chinchilla coat. In a sea of expensive clothing, it stood out like a lighthouse. But it wasn't just the coat that caught his attention. It was the mathematics of the situation that didn't add up. Roberts knew celebrities, he knew athletes, he knew the mobsters too, recognized their faces from surveillance photos and investigations. He could place almost everyone in those front row seats within the ecosystem of New York power, except one man. The man in the coat was a blank space, an unknown quantity radiating wealth in the middle of a crowd where everyone was accounted for. Roberts turned to other officers, pointing discreetly. "Who's that?" Nobody knew. They asked around, queried detectives from other precincts, even checked with some of the arena staff. The man was a ghost. No name, no background, no obvious source of legitimate income that would explain his presence in a seat that cost more than a car. But there he sat, completely comfortable, watching two champions try to kill each other while wearing a fortune on his shoulders. The questions that night planted seeds that would grow into a full investigation. Roberts began to dig. If the man was at the fight of the century, he wasn't small time. Street dealers didn't have that kind of money or access. This was someone operating at a high level, someone connected enough to obtain impossible tickets, rich enough to dress like royalty, and confident enough to sit among America's elite without fear. That combination suggested organization, infrastructure, serious money flowing from somewhere into someone's pockets. Over the following weeks and months, Roberts assembled a task force. They started identifying faces from that night, cross-referencing them with known associates of drug traffickers. They followed leads that went nowhere, chased rumors that evaporated, hit dead ends that frustrated the entire team. But Roberts kept coming back to the man in the chinchilla coat. Someone had to know him. Someone had to have seen him before. The coat itself became a lead. How many black men in Harlem could afford chinchilla? How many furriers sold coats like that? Where did the money come from? Eventually, A name surfaced: Frank Lucas. Not from the coat, but from informants, from surveillance of known drug locations, from the patient, grinding work of building a case brick by brick. When they finally connected Lucas to that night at Madison Square Garden, everything clicked into place. The wealth, the confidence, the mystery, it all made sense. Lucas wasn't just another dealer, he was running something bigger than anyone had suspected, operating at a level that explained the chinchilla and the front row seat and the absolute comfort among celebrities. The investigation intensified. Wiretaps went up, surveillance teams tracked Lucas's movements, undercover operations targeted his network. What had begun with a detective's curiosity at a boxing match evolved into one of the largest drug busts in New York history. Lucas had made himself visible, and visibility, it turned out, was a spotlight that revealed everything. The coat that was supposed to announce his arrival instead announced his location to everyone looking for him. He had spent years being invisible, and one night of vanity undid all that careful work. The police weren't just watching anymore, they were closing in, and the man who had been so smart for so long had given them the opening they needed. All because he wanted the world to see him wearing a coat. There's a particular cruelty in the way Frank Lucas destroyed himself. He hadn't been caught by superior police work, at least not initially. He hadn't been betrayed by a trusted lieutenant or exposed by a rival looking to eliminate competition. The empire he had built through extraordinary cunning and discipline didn't fall because of any flaw in his business model or any weakness in his operation. It fell because he couldn't resist the most human of temptations, the desire to be seen, to be recognized, to have his success acknowledged by the world he had conquered from the shadows. For years, Lucas had been a ghost moving through Harlem with complete freedom. While other dealers announced themselves with flash and glamour, he had played a different game entirely. He understood something fundamental that most criminals never grasp, that power doesn't need to be displayed to be real, that wealth doesn't require witnesses to exist, that true control operates best when nobody knows who's pulling the strings. He had watched men far less successful than himself get arrested because they couldn't resist custom suits and flashy cars and jewelry that caught the light. He had seen the pattern repeat endlessly: make money, show off, get noticed, get arrested. It was so predictable it was almost boring. Lucas had sworn he would be different. He had rules, discipline hammered into him by Bumpy Johnson, the legendary Harlem crime boss who had mentored him before dying in 1968. Bumpy had taught him that survival meant invisibility, that the moment you let your ego write checks your discretion couldn't cash, you were finished. Lucas had taken those lessons to heart, building an operation that imported heroin directly from Southeast Asia, cutting out the Italian middlemen, creating a supply chain so efficient it revolutionized the New York drug trade. He made millions, maybe tens of millions, and almost nobody outside his immediate circle knew his name. But success has a weight to it. Money accumulates not just in bank accounts, but in the psychology of the person making it. Every $1 million Lucas earned whispered to him that he had achieved something extraordinary, that he deserved recognition, that he had beaten the system so thoroughly he no longer needed to hide from it. The discipline that had protected him began to feel like a prison. What was the point of being a king if you had to pretend to be a peasant? What good was wealth if you couldn't enjoy it openly, if you couldn't walk into the most important cultural event of the decade and claim your rightful place among the powerful? So he bought the coat. He got the tickets. He sat in the front row at the Ali Frazier fight. And for one glorious night, Frank Lucas was visible. He was someone. He mattered. Celebrities sat near him. Photographers captured him in their frames. And the world, or at least the small slice of the world that mattered to him, could see that a black man from nothing had become something magnificent. The irony is almost poetic. Lucas had spent years being brilliant precisely because he resisted what other criminals couldn't. His competitive advantage was his anonymity. While the Italian mob families operated like corporations with known hierarchies and recognizable faces, Lucas moved like smoke, untouchable because he was unseen. That invisibility had made him rich beyond imagination and kept him free when others went to prison. Then he threw it all away for one night of validation, one moment of being recognized as successful in a room full of successful people. The chinchilla coat became the symbol of his downfall, but it was really about something deeper. It was about the fundamental impossibility of being a criminal mastermind and a public success simultaneously. Those two identities cannot coexist. The moment you step into the light to receive applause, you become a target. The same visibility that satisfies the ego destroys the operation. Lucas understood this intellectually. He had always understood it. But understanding and accepting are different things. He wanted both worlds, the fortune and the fame, and the fight of the century seemed like the perfect moment to claim them both. He got his moment. The photographs exist, capturing him in that magnificent coat sitting among legends. For one night, he was visible, recognized, undeniable. And it cost him everything.